Good evening. Thank you everyone for being with us tonight. My name is Katie Joseph, and I am the Director of Policy and Advocacy at Interfaith Alliance. We are a national policy and advocacy organization that works to advance an inclusive vision of religious freedom here in Washington, D.C. on the federal level, as well as in states and in communities across the country through our affiliate network. I'm joined tonight by two incredible scholars, thought leaders, and experts to talk about the challenging but urgently necessary topic of confronting Christian nationalism. And before we jump in, I just want to acknowledge that tonight Jewish communities across the country and around the world begin the holiday of Purim, in which we read the book of Esther, and we celebrate the triumph of an everyday person, an everyday woman who was faced with a threat, living in a religiously diverse place, found herself in a position to make a difference for herself and for her community with the knowledge that she had. And so using creative means, working in the system and outside the system, not only did she triumph, but her community thrived. So as we begin to think about the topic of confronting Christian nationalism and the question of what it means to build a more inclusive democracy, I encourage us to bring some of that spirit to tonight's conversation. So let me introduce our guests tonight. Our first guest is Holly Hollman. She is the General Counsel and Associate Executive Director of the Baptist Joint Committee on Religious Liberty. She provides legal analysis of church-state issues that arise before Congress, in the courts, and administrative agencies, and often consults with churches, community leaders, and organizations like Interfaith Alliance on matters of religious freedom and democracy. And she serves as an adjunct professor of law at the Georgetown University Law Center, where she teaches the Church-State Law Seminar. Our other guest tonight is Eric Ward. Eric is the Executive Director of the Western State Center and a Senior Fellow with the Southern Poverty Law Center and Race Forward. He is a nationally recognized expert on the relationship between authoritarian movements, hate violence, and preserving inclusive democracy. And he is currently working on a documentary about whiteness and race in America. Eric also serves as the co-chair for the Proteus Fund and co-founded Funders for Justice, a national network and organizing platform that mobilizes resources for grassroots organizing at the intersection of racial justice, gender justice, and building models for community safety and justice. Thank you both so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
So as we turn to our conversation about Christian nationalism, we've seen a lot of media coverage of the idea of Christian nationalism, what feels for many like a growing movement around this idea, this term. But I want to ask Holly, if you can. We'll open up the Q&A function in just a moment, but let's start with just setting the table. What do we mean when we say Christian nationalism? What isn't it? And what is it and what isn't it?
Thank you so much, Katie. Thank you to Interfaith Alliance for your long partnership and work as a coalition partner on religious freedom issues. It's wonderful to be here with you and to be here with Eric Ward and to have this invitation to talk about Christian nationalism. And as this program rightly recognizes its overlap with white supremacy. To talk about what Christian nationalism is, I need to back up a little bit and talk about what I'm drawing from here. BJC has worked for more than 8 decades to advance faith freedom for all. And that really is to put forward, to advance religious freedom from the historic Baptist perspective. But we do this for all people, working with people across the religious and political spectrum. And in doing that, we support the separation of church and state. So we have always fought the idea that some people hold, that we are a Christian nation. In our basic education work, we always have to respond to the alarming numbers that show up in polls of how many people think we are a Christian nation. Now, in a basic BJC education course, we quickly talk about how sometimes people just mean that demographically. They just mean, well, there's a majority of people who claim Christian identity. So that's not so bad. That's fine. We can get past that. But it's also a lot of people haven't looked at the Constitution to see how we protect religious liberty for all. And as a law professor, I'd have to say it would be a very strange way to create a Christian nation to do what our founders did by separating the institutions of religion and government. But what I want to talk about tonight is Christian nationalism as we've seen it in a more persistent form, and sort of a rising, what seems to be a rising problem. A few years ago, we were understanding that the people were having much harder time finding connection on religious freedom. And sometimes it was because they were confronting these ideas of Christian nationalism. And we were working with a broad range of other Christian groups, and at the urging of a lot of our interfaith and other partners, to really focus on Christian nationalism and provide some resources, some explanation, and some strategies of how to approach it. And the definition that we work with is this one, that Christian nationalism is this idea, this political ideology and cultural framework that sort of merges one's American identity and Christian identity. And we came up with that idea, is that that's kind of, you can see just on its face how that is at odds with our religious freedom tradition that holds us together as Americans, right? I wanted to talk about, you can see the second bullet point there is one thing when you're talking about what Christian nationalism is, and we'll come back to that when I introduce Eric in a minute, that there is considerable overlap with white supremacy and racial subjugations. What we did is to respond to this is we launched a program, a project called Christians Against Christian Nationalism, and it has lots of resources for you to draw on to come back to after this program, and I think it'll be really helpful. The thing that's important to get at the outset about what it's not is that it's a political ideology, you can see at odds with religious freedom. What it's not is a statement about Christianity in general. And Christianity is a world religion that has many different that draws from the Bible and centers on the life and teaching of Jesus of Nazareth. And there are these different branches, most familiar, Catholic and Protestant and Orthodox, and then many denominations within Protestantism, and all these different expressions of Christianity. So it's really important not to assume that Christians in America are all Christian nationalists. Of course they're not. You're talking right now to Christians who are committed to religious freedom. So it's important to make that distinction clear. It will also help when you're engaging with people on a public policy matter debate, and you know that they come from a Christian perspective, a faith or other faith perspective, just to be clear that just because someone talks about Christianity in a public policy or as a motivation, that doesn't mean they're a Christian nationalist, right? We all have the right to bring our faith and our perspective to the debates on any policy matters. That's one of the parts, that was one of the key statements in our Christians Against Christian Nationalism statement, is saying that we're all equal citizens and have the right to come and talk about policy, to bring our particular faith perspective. So we've got this definition. What does it look like? This slide just shows a few pictures to just show the kind of wide-ranging way that you can think about Christian nationalism, from something that some people might say is very innocent, subtle, to the most extreme. So a flag in a sanctuary, what does a flag have to do with Christianity? I can tell you America's not in the Bible. It's not a biblical concept. It's neither is Santa Claus. And so it's kind of it's just something that may be a tradition. Maybe in this church, it's just there for Veterans Day or a particular emphasis, or maybe it's there all the time and the congregation hasn't really stopped and considered to ask themselves, why is it there? And to think about, who are we as Christians? Who are we as Americans? Then that cross, I know will be familiar to some of you, that's the Bladensburg Cross, a case that went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, where the government was arguing that a Christian cross, clearly the preeminent symbol of Christianity, stood to represent all World War I veterans. So it was a Christian symbol used as a generic symbol for the military, a military that, of course, includes people from all faiths and no faiths. So that's a problem of Christian nationalism, even though it wasn't named such. Then the In God We Trust, we see these efforts to put the motto all through schools and everywhere. Those are efforts that, even if they're held constitutional, show this kind of failure to separate our who we are as a nation and who we are religiously. And of course, this last picture reminds us one of many terrible events where violence was taken in the name of religion against a religious group. And there have been, unfortunately, several incidents where Christian nationalism rises to the level of violence. What are we doing about it? You got to look at it. You got to see what the problem is. You need to. We're asking people within the Christian community broadly to think about who are you as Christians? Who are we as Americans? Understand that we are not united by religion. We can be united as Americans in our commitment to respect for each other and to religious liberty for all. The Christians Against Christian Nationalism project is a platform. It's a great place for Christians to assert that they're against Christian nationalism. It has now over 21,000 signers, and really has been just a grassroots movement. And I think it's continuing to grow with very few clear statements there. But I think the statements will help you see what our focus is to fight this. The platform also has resources, and here's where I think it's going to be really helpful for many of you who, of course, are not in the Christian community, but in other faith communities or are working in your communities across a broad perspective. And that is this one pager on Christian nationalism, where we draw on some of the best academic thinkers who have really done a lot of polling to show the pervasiveness of Christian nationalism and how it affects people across a broad spectrum, from those who reject it, to those who kind of resist it, to those who accommodate, to those who are really out there ambassadors for Christian nationalism. And when you understand that, it gives us ways to engage people in civil discourse and dialogue to really try to understand what's what and what can bring us together and what can be so damaging to us as a nation. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Eric to talk more about white supremacy and the other real dangers of not confronting this kind of ideology.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be with everyone today. Thank you for joining. Again, my name is Eric Ward, Executive Director of Western State Center. You know, when we think about Christian nationalism and theocracy in America, and we juxtapose that with the events of January 6th in Washington, D.C., the day of the insurrection. And let's be clear, the insurrection that occurred there wasn't merely to dispute a process or a disagreement over an issue. It was an effort to overthrow the United States government. It is not one that began on January 6th. It was actually decades in the making. I think of my own life when I moved up from California to the Pacific Northwest in the mid-1980s. I wasn't the only one to have migrated from Southern California to the Pacific Northwest. Many in the Pacific Northwest say too many of us have migrated up north. But right before me, another Californian moved up, and his name was Richard Butler. Richard Butler was a pastor, a retired Air Force or aircraft engineer, a veteran of World War II, and as I said, the head of a congregation. He also moved to the Pacific Northwest, but he moved to Idaho. And he moved to a place in northern Idaho called Hayden Lake and reestablished his church. And the name of the church was Church of Jesus Christ Christian Aryan Nations. The Aryan nations had three core beliefs. The first was that Jews were the literal children of Satan. The second was that people of color were nothing more than chattel, meaning nothing more than beasts in the fields and without souls. The third was that white Northern Europeans were the true descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. This was a pseudo-religious philosophy called Christian identity. But in the 80s and 90s, Christian identity reigned supreme within the white nationalist movement. There were over 100 congregations that existed around the country. Now, while they had varying beliefs, what united them was the belief that the United States was properly and solely a white nation. Many of us looked at the Aryan nations and its acts of violence with horror. And those of us who were Christians were deeply offended by the eschatology and the theology being pushed by the Christian identity movement. But the truth was this, that what the Christian identity movement was teaching, these extremists as we called them, wasn't that distant from what we had been teaching in mainstream Christianity for generations. For instance, I grew up Southern Baptist. I was baptized at the age of 12 in Long Beach, California. Long Beach is really just an extension of Kentucky. So those in Kentucky know what I'm talking about when you could say it was hard to turn around without running into a Southern Baptist convention. Well, one of the things that I was taught going to Sunday school was that interracial dating was wrong, right? And it was wrong because Black folks and other people of color were considered inferior. That was while visiting a neighboring Southern Baptist church for a Sunday class one day. It wasn't that long in American history where many mainstream churches accused Jews maybe of not being the literal children of Satan, but in some cases so, but as the spiritual descendants. I share this because there is one lesson as we talk about white supremacy, white nationalism, and Christian nationalism. The first is that groups don't come into our communities bringing racism or anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, and other forms of bigotry with them. That they simply organize the bigotry that already exists in our communities. Left unchecked, that bigotry provides a fuel for these movements. You often hear me talk about white nationalism. When I speak of white nationalism, I differentiate from white supremacy. White supremacy is a system of exploitation that is long lasting in the United States. It predates the United States. White supremacy was built off the idea that certain people were superior simply based off of their skin color, and that other people were inferior based off of their skin color. The dichotomy was white and Black. This idea of white superiority and convincing people that they were superior because of their skin color allowed our country and the society that preceded it to do three things. It allowed us to other through the genocide and stolen resources of Native people, hundreds of years of chattel slavery, a brutal system of slavery like none other that stripped people of their very humanity, and the control of women. It is these three pillars that allowed our society to organize. This is one of those moments where I tell people to take a really big, deep breath, because we should understand something. None of us are responsible for how our society was constructed. None of us were around. In many ways, we are experiencing the legacies of that structure. And at most, we're responsible to try to repair the harm and to move our society and our communities and our families forward in a healthy way, in a way that seeks healing over discrimination and exclusion. But this is the system that many of us were born into. As we used to teach in Walnut Southern Baptist Church, in the same way that many of us are built into systems that we don't have control over, we can still affect change through the decisions we make as individuals and the decisions we make as a community or congregation. Well, in 1960s, this country made a decision. It wasn't an easy decision, but the decision was to challenge white supremacy as the rule of law. We had something called the Civil Rights Movement. Many may have heard of it, the 1960 Civil Rights Movement. Interesting enough, the 1960 Civil Rights Movement actually starts in the 1930s and 40s, but it is the 1960s that we look at, when African Americans and others who joined them in the South stood together to challenge Jim Crow and the idea of separate but equal. They were successful. Now imagine for a second, you've grown up your entire life being socialized to think Black people were inferior. How then do you come to terms that you've now suffered one of the biggest defeats against people you see as inferior? Do you all of a sudden say, well, I guess I was wrong, and then switch your worldview? Not likely. That's not how many of us function in the world. But an answer had to be created. How could people who saw themselves as superior lose to folks they saw as inferior? So those who believed in Jim Crow and believed in arch segregation came up with an answer. In short, if white supremacy, the system of exploitation, was built on racism, the response to the loss of the civil rights movement was grounded in anti-Semitism, and it's called white nationalism. Anti-Semitism isn't just at the core of white nationalism. It is actually the core of white nationalism. And it's so central to white nationalism that marginalized communities in this country will never win equity if we're not also active in the struggle to uproot anti-Jewish hate. Amongst 21st century white nationalists, Jews are cast in the same roles they have always filled for anti-Semites, as the absolute other, demons stirring a pot of lesser evils, and the driving force behind white dispossession. At the foundation of that modern day movement is an explicit claim that Jews are a separate race, not merely a religious other, but a racialized other, and that their ostensible position as white is the greatest trick that the devil ever played. Jews, despite and indeed because of the fact that they are seen largely as white, are perceived as white nationalists as an enemy race that must be exposed and eliminated. This fantasy of invisible Jewish power explains how Black Americans, a race of supposed inferiors, could orchestrate the end of Jim Crow, how feminists in the LGBTQ community could upend quote unquote traditional gender roles, and how immigrant workers could mount a challenge to economic inequality. Folks often ask me, where is the anti-Semitism within the white nationalist movement? It's everywhere. When the Tree of Life shooter says Jews were committing a genocide against white people, he was using language that was intimately familiar to his fellow white nationalists. Such rabid anti-Semitism is the framework in which the entire white nationalist movement functions. To refuse to deal with any ideology of domination is to abet it. And fighting anti-Semitism cuts off the animating force of white nationalism for the sake of all of our communities. When we talk about the growth of white nationalism, though, we should understand that its intersection with Christian nationalism is quite real. On January 6th, we saw a number of different groups that had gathered in the nation's capital, from hardcore neo-Nazis to those who truly believe the false information that the elections had been stolen. to those who thought that their Second Amendment rights were being taken away. While different tendencies came together, as I said before, they were united in one belief, in the overthrow of the US government. Christian nationalism and white nationalism to Western State Center is understood in one way, not as an anti-government movement, but merely anti-government that seeks to create an inclusive society, one that is people-centered, transparent, and accountable. In short, we have to understand that for the white nationalist movement, the title Christian is merely another euphemism for whiteness. How do we know this? Because we have witnessed over the last decades countless African-American churches that have been set on fire. The massacre that occurred in Charleston, South Carolina. While all of these were driven by individuals who believed they were in existential war against Jews, they targeted African-Americans. In El Paso, it was Latinos. In Wisconsin, it was the Sikh community, because they are seen as puppets of their Jewish puppet masters. It is why we have to understand the centrality of anti-Semitism in undoing both Christian nationalism and white nationalism in America. To take it on means that Christians who oppose this form of authoritarianism, nationalism, this form of bigotry, need to become vibrant in their voices. Let's be clear about one thing in closing. Neither white nationalism or Christian nationalism is winning because they are more sophisticated, or because they are better organizers, or because they have better resources. They are winning because no one is competing against them in this moment. This is not a battle over policies. It is a battle over the imagination of what America can be. Can it be a society where everyone can live, love, worship, and work free from bigotry and fear? Can it be a society that is grounded in our values of generosity and in kindness and prosperity, health, and safety? Or will we continue to devolve from 75 years of civil rights gains into fiefdoms that resemble things we have seen outside the United States, in places like Yugoslavia, in places like the Sudan, and even in places like Canada? If we do not take the threat of this type of ultranationalism seriously, we will lose by default. There is no neutral position here. This is a battle over the values of our society, the future that we tend to leave for our children. And we do not get there without standing up, understanding the challenges that face us, and closing ranks. It doesn't mean we have to hold the same belief systems. What it means is that we have to hold the same values. Our ideologies sometimes prevent us from understanding what we have in common. Moving forward with counter narratives and visions of what America can be means moving out of our ideological silos, formatting together the values that align us as a nation, and then making those values a reality through policy, through engagement. This is not about restricting the freedom of speech and the assembly of white nationalists or Christian nationalists. This is about reviving the fire that draws out our voices, our feet, and our arms to surround the country we say we love. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you. And I love that you talked about not only the divisive forces that we're seeing that seek to pit us against one another and claim supremacy in various ways, but we also have to think from a visionary perspective, the world that we're looking to create. What do we aspire to? How do we lift up and celebrate one another to move forward together? And Holly, so much of your work is focused on religious freedom. What does that mean for people of all faiths and of none? So I hope you can maybe talk a little bit for us about what that vision of an inclusive religious freedom looks like in the education work that you do, as well as the policy and legal work that you do.
Yeah. Well, it is one of those American ideals, right? That despite our failure to fully live into it, that we can be proud that our founders at least set out for us, right? Like liberty and equality, justice for all. I think, most Americans would say that's something that they take pride in, that America is a great country of religious freedom. And the best way to get appreciation for it, if you're a Christian in America, is to talk to your Muslim neighbor, talk to your Hindu neighbor, talk to people who come from all over the world and sometimes find that they're able to practice their religion more freely and better in this country that has a secular government and is full of religious people. We all know, and it's Katie's daily work, that religious freedom has become very difficult to talk about, even because people on the left and the right sometimes use religious freedom in careless terms to win an argument, right? You can't violate my religious freedom because that's a foundational principle. It's the first 16 words in the First Amendment. I've got religious freedom, right? That careless use of religious liberty language, combined with some very hard transitions in our culture and in our legal system, things that are just pivotal changes, many things that need to happen and change, but needless to say, cause people to struggle. Sometimes they have made our discussions over religious liberty more difficult. And so I think we've lost some ground in our common understanding. And we fight about a lot of things. We always have on religious liberty because we protect it in different ways. We want everyone to have the opportunity to express their religion, to practice. At the same time, we want government, the Constitution requires government not to do it for us, not to advance it, but not to get in the way. And we fight about a lot of things. And it's hard sometimes to find agreement on exactly where the religious freedom lines go, right? We know that we want people to be able to worship and believe, and we know we want government to stay out of it. But what about this? What about that? What about the way money comes into religious institutions? What about some of these civic expressions of religion in the public square that don't rise to the level of a big Christian cross on government property, but these more minor things? And so I think a lot of that we sometimes get confused and lost in these little areas, and so we don't really focus on religious freedom. But when we have this conversation about Christian nationalism and the call to action that Eric was putting before us about thinking what kind of country we are, you really have to affirm that our religious freedom tradition says that we are all welcome without regard to our faith, and we are responsible to stand with our neighbors and to protect their religious liberty, not just in policy and law, but in practice. And, you can't have, I can do all the constitutional advocacy in the world and the court can uphold strong religious freedom protections. But if my neighbor feels threatened and can't go to their house of worship without being threatened, then they don't have religious freedom. So I think there's a real need, there's a definite connection here, and that as a country, we are struggling and we need to come together and we can find this common ground and this compassion for each other. For many people, they will find it by looking in their faith tradition, notwithstanding all the baggage that we might have, that Eric was pointing out that we have. There are principles within most faith traditions that require us to look out for each other, to look out for our neighbors, to stand with others. And there's certainly traditions in our American democratic values to recognize that we are equal citizens and that we all have the right to come into the public square and to debate policy and to vote and to run for office and to participate without having to be of one particular religion, and should be able to without threat to ourselves.
Yes, and I was particularly struck this week. There was a statement that was issued by hundreds of evangelical leaders from across the country, specifically condemning Christian nationalism, using that phrase and being very upfront about the role that many of their very congregations have played in upholding racial oppression, and the melding of and misuse of those traditions to cause some real harm over time. To see kind of that call to action and a recognition, a commitment, not just to name it, but then to say we got to do the work.
Look inwardly.
Yeah, exactly. It was really it seemed like a moment of promise, and it should not have taken us seeing what took place on January 6th to bring us here. But we are here, and we got a question from Alicia, who's in Des Moines. And Eric, I might direct this to you, because you started speaking to kind of the victories that many groups who have been historically marginalized or oppressed in different ways are seeing their rights advanced, their place in American life held on equal footing as others. And Alicia asked, what's different about these movements that we're seeing now? Are they different in character, in kind, in strength? And what should we make of that?
Yeah. So the movements we're seeing come up now, I actually think are in terms of the white nationalism. So let me talk about across the political spectrum. So what we're seeing different in terms of the white nationalist movement is we are seeing a consolidation of that movement. It has moved from the margins of society into the mainstream. It is able now to take part in coalitions, right? And that makes it not only dangerous in the sense of its political violence, but its ability to influence policy, right, and regulations. And it is a movement, right? If white supremacy is a system of exploitation, we should be clear that white nationalism seeks ethnic cleansing, right? The removal of people of color and Jews altogether. It is an authoritarian movement in every sense of the way. If we're looking at the 1960s and the legacy of the 1960s civil rights movement, it has galvanized a host of individuals around the country, right? Human rights, racial justice, economic justice, environmental justice, right? Faith organizations, right? Who seek to try to create a diverse, an America, right? That can hold the diversity of this society. And it is a practice in democracy building. But there is a new trend there that we also must be aware of, right? It is a movement that is growing increasingly, right, concerned and weary, and is beginning to lose belief, right, that this is a country that really seeks repair and reconciliation. And my fear is that at a time when things are so, the contrast is so stark, right, that it increases the potential for political violence, right, and continual political alienation at a time where many of us need to try to construct a common ground. And let me talk about this really quickly, about why I think constructing common ground is important. When I talk about constructing common ground, I'm sure there are like 8 people right now who are like literally like rolling their heads. And they're rolling their heads because we hear this term a lot. We hear this call for unity, right? The call for a center. I'm not saying that, right? What I'm saying is that unless we are all committed to some process of domination, this idea that I'm going to dominate others so that society can be constructed in my way, we have to, and I'm not, we have to find another path. And the way that we find that path is by creating spaces where we come together, not to convert one another, but to identify the values we have in common that allow us to address the issues of our day. This is why it resonates with me as a person who, again, grew up Southern Baptist, right? The idea that you do have a larger consideration and responsibility to society. And I have the right, right, at my own community or family level, right, to really engage in deep conversations around practices and beliefs, right, and how they influence that conversation, not dominate that conversation, right, but influence it so we're continually finding common ground. And we have gotten into a place right now in our country where we think, right, that it is more interesting to draw blood from one another, right, than to help each other raise our barns. And we need to get ourselves back into a country, right, where we turn out for our neighbors to help them build their barns. And of course, everyone knows I mean that symbolically as well. But we don't get there unless we begin to construct new ways of engaging with one another. I have to tell you, we spend way too much time focused on the folks who are on the outsides of our society, rather than trying to consolidate the conversations within society. The truth is, what separates us is not as vast as we tell ourselves.
And we have gotten a number of questions on exactly this point, and I want to encourage everyone who is with us tonight, if you have a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We have gotten a number of questions about how do we find common ground, and particularly, and maybe most painfully, within families. And Holly, the question is how. I think one of the questions phrased it as, how do I talk to family members about their beliefs and my own without arguing?
Yeah, I think we need to start with the value that's been lost a lot in our political sphere, and it's supposed to be part of our Christian tradition, which is humility. To first listen to someone else. You can't just go in and fix. I mean, this conversation that's going on in Christian circles right now is kind of awakening up and saying, what did we do wrong? And oh my goodness, what is this? And I didn't think of it as this. And so there needs to be room for that kind of discussion. I am a firm believer in asking people about what they think, what they feel, and what is that based on? What's your experience? Kind of see if you can separate the experience from their Facebook feed, and because then how much time to spend talking and how fruitful that conversation is going to be. But I think that first step is being okay, is being willing to ask someone and be willing to hear something that's hard to hear, and when these are relationships, your family that you care about, affirming that you care for them, that you're always going to be family, and see if you can talk and understand each other, and look for these common ground perspectives. I mean, I would have thought this because I have dedicated my career to religious freedom, but I wasn't totally sure when we launched the Christians Against Christian Nationalism. The people who agreed with these statements, just a few statements that are anti-Christian nationalists, they're more who we are as Americans in general, a lot more of that than Christianity. We're not trying to define Christianity because it's wide, but the signers come from every denomination, every geographic area, dozens of denominations, every state, rural and urban, clergy and lay people. It's Baptists and Methodists and Episcopalians and Catholics and Mormons and Southern. It's people at their heart. I agree with Eric that there are things that bring us together, and that you see that in a Christian community who's really fighting to figure all this out and what is their voice in the public square that's changed. A lot of them are feeling very defensive, and I think it's also true just as neighbors and Americans. That we need these opportunities to ask each other and figure out what you agree upon. And sometimes we're surprised. And sometimes things don't match up, but that's okay. It's a process to kind of figure out what you think and why you think and how you've been influenced and what you really care about.
And Eric, you've been involved in this work in the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere with folks who've been pulled into white supremacist movements. What does that work look like in helping someone rethink some of that really toxic stuff that they've bought into?
Yeah. So the first rule for kind of what I call courageous dialogue, that's how it was shared with me, is you have to enter that space, whether you're talking about a family member or whether you're talking about someone who's a hardcore white nationalist. You have to enter that space with actual curiosity. You actually have to be willing and capable and wanting to hear. If you're going into debate, if you are going into to attempt a conversion, right? To just show someone that if they just understood something, they would see the world differently. And conversation isn't going to go very far. In fact, what I'll tell people is that you will end up reinforcing for that person, not helping them clarify their own world, right? And so we have to be a little bit, it's funny, I'm going to say this, you have to be a little bit careful, right, of not going in with kind of an evangelical mindset, right, in these conversations. And so what I tell folks is to practice the 5 whys, right? When you are talking with someone, instead of responding with your own thoughts, follow up with 5 questions, right? And those questions should all start with why. And they should all seek for you are trying to clarify and broaden your own understanding of how this person thinks. What you're trying to do is open up the space for people to be able to talk with one another rather than trying to reposition one another. So that's the first. The second is to understand this. The process of someone coming out of a cult or coming out of a politically violent movement is very complex. The truth is that most people eventually leave for 3 reasons. Either they are facing some type of criminal trial or penalty, right? That pushes them out. They are treated terribly in some way by individuals within that white nationalist movement. Or the third is their children, typically. Typically, folks who have children, who have young children, are more likely to end up leaving the movement than any other grouping. And I've heard story after story from individuals about why that is, from the former spokesperson of the Aryan Nations, Floyd Cochran, who left after he overheard folks saying that his son would have to be euthanized because he had been born with a cleft lip. Or another individual in Oregon who left, he was the head of an organization called Aryan Pride, who left because one day he caught himself yelling at his 3-year-old daughter who was watching Sesame Street and completely enjoying herself. And he was mad that there was a Black and Latino character there. And he shut off the TV and his daughter broke down in tears. And that was the moment that he decided that he would leave. So we have to understand, keeping space for conversation is critically important, right? Not all of us can do that, but there are some folks who can do that. And that tends to be family members and friends. And it's quite a commitment. The second is understanding the process of departure is very complicated. But if those individuals have no place to go at the point that they want to leave, they are less likely to do that. So having places for folks to be able to go and to rebuild their lives is critically important. The third is that we can't be hypocritical, right? I think I'll just end this really quick. I know we're short on time. But I think of a young man who was a white nationalist who was cornered at a protest in Portland. And someone was yelling at him, demanding he answer, why was he there in Portland, right? The mayor didn't want him in Portland. The counter protesters didn't want him in Portland. Why was he there? And this young white nationalist responded in a way that I think all of us should hear. His response was, yeah, I heard we're not wanted, but Portland is a city with a shrinking Black population by both percentage and whole number. You can say you don't want us here, but the fact of the matter is, he went on to say, you're doing something we could never get away with. You're actually disappearing the Black population of Portland, Oregon. That was his response. If we continue to allow the inability to construct real equity in our society, and I'm not talking about rainbows and unicorns, I mean a commitment to equity, we continue to look like hypocrites in the face of white nationalists and others who are unsure about the future of our society, who have anxieties for lots of different reasons. We have to dismantle segregation in housing, in how we worship, in schools, in jobs, if we seek to provide a real alternative vision, right, of heaven on earth. It isn't all there is, right, to our faith, but it is one thing that binds us together. What we should understand now is the imperative isn't just on folks of color or LGBTQ folks or immigrants or religious minorities. On January 6th, over 140 law enforcement officers were injured in DC. One was killed. Over the last 4 years, nearly 100 Americans have been killed by white nationalists in this country. The majority of those victims were white Christians, right? We should understand that at the end of the day, nationalism, right, that leads towards authoritarianism, threatens all of us, and it threatens our families in very real ways. The only way to effectively counter it is by putting forth a new vision. We can't do that if we allow segregation to continue to divide us as a nation. We need each other more than ever.
Yes. And as we wind down our conversation today, I thank you both so much for sharing your insights, your experience, and your recommendation, your call to action to be courageous. Holly, let me ask you, for those who want to learn more about the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign, I know there are resources for folks who want to learn more about how to talk about this and recognize it in their communities and perhaps even in themselves. How can they get involved? So
the website, sometimes you just got to call something what it is. So christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. And like I said, I think the signing statement is helpful because the more thousands of people that sign it, the more prominence it gets, and people stop and say, oh yes, there are Christians from a broad range of perspectives that say this is not Christian and this is not who we are as America, and fighting Christian nationalism. The resources include a 10-part podcast series that's actually on the BJC website that you can get to from that site, where Amanda Tyler, our executive director, talks to theologians, talks to the historians who know all about the Christian myths that people get a hold of that really inform a lot of Christian nation thinking and journalism. So that's a real good exploration of the topic. And there's a study guide along with that. So if you have a community of people that you trust and have that conversation, it's a great resource. And then, like I said, there's a one-pager that links to there are a couple of books that we have really been recommending. There's a lot of good work out there, but particularly the work of Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, who've written a book called Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, which is really helpful for understanding and allowing you to have these conversations, particularly if this is an issue or problem in your family and your social group. I think it really lends its self toward understanding and being in civil dialogue. And that book and other books are listed on the website. We are continuing to respond to requests like this one, Katie, to talk to an interfaith audience, an audience that is committed to working in the public square across religious lines. We're responding to different requests for the kinds of resources people want and need to help them in their community. Because I agree with Eric that there's hard work, it is possible, and that we have to do it. We have to engage to really decide what kind of country we're going to be.
Thank you. And we've received questions about recordings of this conversation, as well as access to the materials that have been referenced. We will make a recording available, as well as provide links to some of the materials that Holly discussed. Eric, you recently wrote a piece that asked a really important question, and I know we only have a few more minutes left, so I hate to put you on the spot like this. But you asked the question, who are we, America, as we reflect on so many lives lost to COVID, and the loss particularly felt in communities of color, as we see real shifts in political power that are being supported and opposed in moments quite violently. Who are we, America? How do you begin to answer that question to carry us forward after tonight?
Yeah. So quickly, we should understand we are carrying a lot in this moment, from COVID-19 to climate change, right? Weather-related events. There is a lot happening in our society, political violence. We are carrying a lot. And it is important for us to look in the mirror together and see reflected back an image of us that is stronger together, right? A community of interdependent people. And I think when we do, we might surprise each other with the amount of care and concern, particularly when we lead with humility and hospitality, right? These are core values that I have seen as a Black man in America that have transcended race, gender, sexual orientation, and faith over and over. It's time to calm our demographic anxiety with messages and material action centered on the inescapable reality that we are only as strong as the most defenseless among us. We are in a time right now where our country is in great need. We do not survive this and make our way through it intact, neither spiritually or physically, by abandoning our neighbors, abandoning our communities. We do it by leaning in together. So when I say, who are we, America? I ask, are we a nation that is built on exclusion? Or will we finally own and breathe, right, the spirit of inclusion, right, that we have been nurturing inside of this country for generations and haven't allowed it yet to come out? I think that what we will find is that change is always frightening. But the frightening, the fear of change, right, is not as significant, and we shouldn't make it as significant, right, as the danger of staying stuck in the moment that we are in right now. When I talk about white nationalism in America today, no one accuses me of hyperbole anymore after January 6th. And I will tell you this, if we do not provide an alternative vision of America that is grounded in that interdependent values that we all hold, right, we concede this to the white nationalist movement and Christian nationalists, whose goal, right, is to police the faiths and beliefs and the day-to-day lives of all of us, whether you are a Christian or not. They have now had influence on some of the highest offices in our government, and we need to take it with the seriousness that it deserves. That's what it means to be an American in this moment.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who joined us for this conversation tonight. A lot of really difficult things for us to think about, some invitations to action, to introspection, and to do the really hard work of reconciliation as we move forward together. Thank you, Holly. Thank you, Eric, and stay safe and be well.
Thank you.